Non-efficient. All right, we're live. Welcome, everyone. And we have an audience as well, a remote audience participating with us today. And we are here to discuss with Mark Z. Danielewski the first volume of The Familiar. So this is the culmination of what has been very exciting experiment with classroom discussion of Galley copies of a forthcoming novel. So we have had the chance, we've been very fortunate, we've had the chance to help frame the conversation. And as I told everyone here on the first day, and no doubt as the professors and students with us as well were discussing, we have had the chance to frame the conversation for the reviewers. So we've had a very rare opportunity to help shape the opinion of the novel. And the dialogue that we're going to have today is a kind of culmination of the online dialogue that we've had. So here with us, just to be clear for those watching, is to my left, Mark Z. Danielewski. And I think maybe it would be nice to start just with your thoughts about the experiment, what you had hoped to have happen, whether you found it satisfying to listen in to our conversation, high points, low points.
Well, I think the most familiar experience and the strangest experience is typically when a book is released. Hello, everyone. It's already finished, and for many authors, it may have been finished a year ago. And I realized as I sat down here that I'm sitting down with a living book. I think we don't know. The book itself, as you're all aware, is going to be 27 volumes. So very much like Xanther at the very end of Volume 1, we're holding a creature that may be very alive or may not be alive at all. And so, rather than frame this experience in terms of my past, it becomes immediately present and part of the future. So already I've been thinking about ideas for Volume 3, Volume 4. I'm already finishing Volume 2. Even now, I'm faced with the puzzle of what to do with a kind of a title sequence, which is going to precede the actual release on May 12th of the book. So it'll be very much like a television title sequence. And of course, we don't have the riches of True Detective or AMC Mad Men or something like that, but we're still sort of playing with that. And then we were wondering, well, are we just going to introduce just the publisher, just me, or perhaps introduce the characters? So right now the idea is that we'll actually introduce all the characters. And then the question is, well, what should we tag each character's name? So should it be like, Anwar Ibrahim, loving father, or you could have that voice of the Narcon 9 that sort of comes in, like Luther on the hunt, Osgur on the hunt 2, or something like that. And then I was thinking, well, everyone's read it, and we could easily have a moment to sort of solicit ideas of like, what is this? What if you were going to put on your sort of the corniest like television commercial voice that you had in your head, your own your own TV ad Narcon, what would be the descriptor that you would put for all those characters? And so, point being, just in terms of where I am as an author, that doesn't happen. When you finish the book, you're more kind of withdrawing from the book already and trying to sort of maybe reconnect to the book via how your readers experience. But here it's more like, oh, how does that affect that? How can this actually continue to live? And then little thoughts that may, percolate up here can have a vibrancy that can have an effect on Volume 6, for example. And I guess a question that I would put back to everyone here is that an exciting process, a terrifying process, to think that you actually could be involved in the process of what happens to the familiar? Because as much as all the characters are fated, as much as I know the ending to this book, I also know that that ending is at least 10 years away, and therefore it could change. The fate of all those characters must change simply by your presence. And you're the very first ones here. Like, you may change those attitudes, you may change directions, and subtle changes that may take place in volume 3 could have enormous consequences by volume 20. And so that for me is very exciting. You know, it's kind of a feedback loop that doesn't exist. It's you know, rather than talk about the sepulchers of literature, this mausoleum is inhabited by something that's very much alive at the moment.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, not to put you on the spot, but was there anything in our online conversation that really stuck with you, that caused you to rethink the plot direction for volume 2 or 3? In other words,
well, it's too early to say, but definitely the amount of attention that the Narcons got, for instance, that was something that, like, it was sort of fascinating to me that was such an attaching point. You know, so of course, as I'm working on the Narcons, which almost had a separate narrative, so the way I'm doing the final polish on volume 2 is to go separately through each character. So I will be, if I'm working on Jingjing, then I'm sort of just completely, you know, involved with, you know, Singaporean slang. I'm reading a book on Malay mysticism. And then if I'm working on Luther, then I'm talking to people who not only speak Spanish from Mexico City, but speak Spanish that came from Spain, Mexico City, and has now changed in Los Angeles. And so I'm then sort of steeped in all of that. But the Narcon section will be something that I do at the very end. So even though that they're in place, I'll track that narrative once all of it has been assembled, all of these parts. So that's very exciting. And also I was impressed by how sharp readers were, you know. And then I think the other thing that stuck with me is that how difficult it is to write about something that's unfinished. It's a challenge to everyone. I mean, like, well, what if I go in a different direction? Does that just nullify everything you've written? And how do you write about something to which you don't know the conclusion, you know? And that is fascinating, because I think that is a good skill, because that's how we live, you know? We like to sort of impose ourselves, our plans, our dreams on the future, and yet by this point, everyone in the room knows how often all of that goes askew and awry. And so then the question is, how do I make peace with a future that may change? How do I make peace with something that is clearly present, clearly is coherent maybe in this moment, in these pages, but even if it changes, doesn't alter the validity of what I've just said? And so finding a way to have a language for that, to analyze that, is good for anything. It's good for what's going on in your life, what you're seeing in culture today, what you might imagine culture may change into.
Oh, that's great. So, of course, there's the comparison between the novel and television. You know, we start there, and this relates in a sense, because we had talked occasionally about what it would mean if this becomes like season 1 of Freaks and Geeks, if you know that reference, meaning it doesn't complete itself or isn't able to be completed. So, I mean, do you have a grand statement to make, or do you want to shy away from making grand statements about the relationship between the novel and television and the televisual serial? Or
well, the grand statement. Could you hold up the advanced reading?
Yes.
Copy? That's my grand statement. My advanced copy finally arrived, and I'm extremely happy with it. I feel like anything I say isn't going to add to that. Yeah, I mean, I've said before that House of Leaves remediates the film movies, and by remediates we mean to take from one form of media and put it into another. But of course, it's also a prickly word and has all sorts of other wonderful little spots of connectivity with other themes. And then Only Revolution remediates music. The 50-Year Sword remediates the campfire story, and this definitely remediates the television series. And in some ways, it is, you know, true to its title. It's working with familiar tropes. It's working with familiar forms. It's also part of sort of the administrative life of it, is the apparatus that surrounds it that you can't see in this version is just as important. That my publisher would sign on for 2 seasons, which is 5 volumes per season, 10 volumes total. Incredibly exciting, you know, an act of faith. But at the end of the day, they know that a publishing house like that can't support a whole project. It will require readers. It will require the involvement, of others for this to live. And that's exciting, for me as well. And it's also very in keeping with what I understand of television writing. It's not something that I could have done on my own. There is this, the Atelier Z, which my assistant Michelle named at one point. She says, sort of like, we'll just call it Atelier Z. And as I've always said, it's not a cage. It's a place of open windows, open doors. So artists drift through, and it was something that I always wanted when I was young. Basically, sort of like, well, could I just participate a little? Could I proofread this? Could I try some art here? Should I do some research? And so, people have come and gone over the last 9 years, and it's slowly built up. But now there are people who really participate, and their name exists in the credit sequence very much like a television series. And at the same time, it's something that's supposed to be beneficial for all who are working on it, but free of the pressure which I alone have to sustain. I'm the heat shield as we're entering the atmosphere. Actually, that's a terrible metaphor, because if I detach, everyone gets burned up behind me. So that's not it. But the pressure, the responsibility is ultimate. I'm the one who has to, finalize everything. I have to, conceive of all of its patterns. But and in terms of the television series, it's also playing with the newness of these big, stories, which is, as we all know, is a recycling of an oldness, this of the serial form, which we could trace back probably all the way to Homer, right? Because Homer wasn't, in some cases, maybe there was a figure who gave all of the Iliad, or, I'm going to binge on the Iliad back then, right? I'm going over here to listen to all of, the Odyssey. But probably it was like parts were told. They sort of, these traveling figures wandered about.
That's great. Should we test out questions just from the room first? Anyone want to pose a question?
I have a kind of random question. Who's your favorite author?
Favorite author? Well, it's tricky. I remember watching a showrunner for a very popular television show, and I was surprised by how inarticulate he was. He was like stuttering all over the place. And then I later watched his show, and I was, floored by how articulate it was. And I felt a sort of camaraderie with him at that moment, because I was like, yeah, you really speak well in these different voices, but when you're trying to find your voice, it's really complicated. And so authors that I adore, I've noticed have started to be framed by the characters that I'm reading, that I'm involved with, And so I was doing some work on Turkey and Armenia, and I was, looking into those characters. So I started reading an old Turkish writer named Said Faik Abasiniak, I think is how you pronounce his last name. The Useless Man, which is a beautiful collection of short stories put out by Archipelago. And that was, for me, as much a pleasure of just sort of understanding what writing, by an author that was born in 1906 was like about a certain, time period, a certain culture, a certain zone, as well as kind of weirdly counterpointing an article that I'm reading right now about Armenia in the New Yorker. Just forgotten the title. So it's not really telling you the favorite book, but it's kind of what my favorite moment was at that point. But I have a question for you. When you're asking that question, what does it mean to have a favorite book? Like, let's say I just picked, one. Like, what would that say to you? Like, when we're asking that question, because certainly I have that all the time, what is that question? What does it mean?
I was gesturing more towards, because I thought this book had a lot of very sentimental moments that you would draw insane attention to. Like, you would literally spread out the pages,
right.
A word a page for 30 pages. And when I have a favorite novel, and I guess most of my favorite novels are distinguished by the sentimentality or the moment in which I was reading them.
Mm-hmm.
It almost reminded me of that when I was about to finish it, and it was drawing the words, I guess, so vastly.
Right.
And so I almost connected it potentially with that. If our attention was being drawn in a certain way for some reason. So.
And was my sentimentality there rooted in a particular fiction? Right?
Yeah, or maybe idea that you got from somewhere else. Because I find I often write thinking about other concepts or things that I've read about in books that I find that are very dear to me,
right,
or very interesting to me, or that have profoundly impacted me.
And when you say sentimental, do you mean fragile?
Sentimental is, I guess, on the simplest level, like a friend giving me a book.
Right.
Or I guess one of my favorite books is Laughter in the Dark, and that's because I read it on the beach one day and I lost it because the wind blew it out of my hand and it fell in the ocean almost. Or,
right.
You know, stuff like that. And you remember books very immediately and intricately with those little things. And sometimes I would find that in your book where it was like, I was remembering very specific things and I was wondering if you were too, I guess.
Interesting, because I think there are decades that are in between us that have an effect. Because I think I know exactly the feelings you're talking about, and at the same time, I also recognize that those feelings have become ghosts for me. Today's my birthday, by the way. I'm 49, so this is the way I decided to celebrate my birthday. Thank you, Rita, for inviting me. And you know, the thing is I realize that as connected as I am to literature, I'm also probably so much professional that I'm always looking at how sentences are put together and kind of the raw, you know, sensation I had when I read King Lear for the first time, or The Odyssey, or, you know, Slaughterhouse-Five, or Catcher in the Rye, or Beloved. You know, that those feelings were at that point, those pieces at that point were lenses before the world that I had yet to face. But now I'm on the other side, and I experience the world knowing that the literature of my youth and of my education is now there sort of as a companion, a comrade, but no longer can stand in front of me anymore. So I'm more reliant on sort of the feelings that those things have sort of inculcated and grown within me to allow me at one moment where I'm stressed beyond belief, I'm working, you know, more than I've ever worked before, to look out my window and notice that there's a squirrel that's moving slightly towards me on a branch instead of away. And over the months, I've actually gotten closer to this squirrel, and now I can recognize the squirrel. So I know exactly the ear markings. And my girlfriend and I refer to him as Poncho, and Poncho knows me. And so as odd as that may seem and as disconnected from the words that we read, there is a way of looking at words as a way of moving you more into the world and not away from the world. And ultimately, the favorite book for all of us should be this world around us. You know, it would disturb me if people got too lost in what I write. I always hope that what I write can become a portal or a lens through which you can then explore this grander, far more complicated world that lives out there.
That's a good question. Let's try one remote question. Can you pull up Lindsay? Yeah. Lindsay, if you can hear us, we're going to pull you up for a question, just to test the test.
No, I understood it perfectly. The answer is yes.
What should we have them do?
Turn down your microphone to ask the question, and then turn it back up, and I'll remute you.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Where is Lindsay?
Lindsay is in Clemson.
Hi, Clemson.
Well, yeah, I know. I wanted to try this at the beginning to see. No.
We can see you, Lindsay.
Anybody need lips?
Okay. All right. Should we try another? Should we try Julia? Julia there, I think, is second from the left. Oh. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Julia. We can't hear you, so hold on a second.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay. So hello from one of the we had. Is this okay?
Yeah, just go ahead and talk. It's going in and out a little bit, but we'll pick it up. It's okay.
Perfect. One of the questions we're wondering about is with your what was a kernel project that Xanther one of the other did you kind of work on one of them and realize that all of this were going to connect? Or were you thinking of online simultaneously?
Okay.
So Julia, the question's coming through in strange music that's, I think, sort of like augmented by feedback loops and whatnot. So just nod if I got the question right, that you're asking if I worked just on Xanther and then later kind of augmented with various stories. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or did I just reduce all of your subtleties to just nothing?
I have a question about the architecture of the project.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tricky because in some ways, yes, the discovery of the cat was kind of a story that was sketched out. Xanther wasn't named Xanther. Xanther wasn't even a girl at that point, you know. It was just the notion of kind of the finding of this creature, and that kind of was sketched out. But I didn't know that it was going to be a book yet. This was actually, I wrote this at the end of Only Revolutions, so probably 2005, 2006, and then put it away. I have actually a ledger that I sort of keep a tally on what I've done every day, so when I bomb out, I can remind myself that, oh, well, 3 days ago I did all right, you know. And there's this kind of little interruption, and at that point I drew out like 4 claw marks right there, so I can sort of see it perfectly. And then that was put aside for at least a year and a half. But then when I started again, I began to hear all the different voices, and so I think the comparison that I've had before is that it's sort of musical in some ways, that as different as the stories and voices may be, it's also necessary that they're counterpoised to alternate stories, alternate narratives, and alternate sounds. You know, so it's not just a question of pushing pause on Xanther and then doing some more and then going back to Xanther. You know, it's that famous Leibowitz quote. You know, conversation is just waiting for your turn to speak. I mean, I think if you just wrote that, if wrote like that, it wouldn't be as fun. But instead, even though it may be a radically different story, a radically different arc, the subsequent section can begin to change what Xanther's going through or what Luther's going through. And there's no way to do it independently. So this is, in fact, exactly the inverse to the process of finishing it. The finishing it is to actually go through just Xanther, just Luther, just, you know, Osgore. Whereas writing it can't be written that way. It has to be written as one. And granted, these things may be very slight, and I fill them in more later, but I have to sort of get the trajectory of all of them. So you can read this just by character if you want. You can follow the dog ears and just read Xanther or just read Jing Jing. And in some ways, that'll be a little easier, certainly at the beginning, because you'll be familiarizing yourself with their language. But they do definitely rely on each other and where they go and what's happening. What is happening to Xanther, say, when Luther and Jing Jing and Astaire are going on? You know, in my mind, I do have an idea that's not necessarily present in the chapters that you read.
That's great. So we're going to try once more with Lindsay. So she says she's got it set up. Thanks, Julia. We're going now to Clemson. All right, Lindsay, you got it?
I don't know why it won't let me unmute.
Is it her mic?
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So we're going to ask you a question, and then we're going to turn you back on.
Okay.
Hold on a second.
Pearl, you can't hear me.
Wait, I know. I'm gonna say what he's gonna say his question. And I'll let you know. Okay, so we have a question about narcotics, and the question is, are you willing to reveal whether or not the narcons are simulating in or whether or not they are collecting data on the world, or if those two things are different at all?
I couldn't hear.
So I think she was asking if you were willing to discuss the simulating the world or matrix style, I suppose, or whether.
All right, can you hear this, Lindsay? Nod? Yeah. Okay, so Rita's now telling me what you just asked me.
So as far as I understood it, she was asking whether, or they were asking whether we were to understand the narcons as generating a world, if it's the matrix narrative, or whether we're to think about them as having some other diegetic function. And surveillance came up as part of this. I suppose the trigger is just, what would you like to say about the narcons?
And one of the questions is, how do I talk about the narcons? I mean, for me, the question today, unlike anything that I've ever written, is how do I talk about the thing that is written and yet unwritten still? You know, I mean, there's certainly elements that I'm not going to talk about because there's a certain amount of interest in what happens, and that is also one of the mechanisms that drives a serialized project along. So for me to sort of betray, you know, any of the characters or the narcons would be unfair. But I think the thing to say about the narcons is there anyone here or in that room over there or any of the rooms that I'm talking to now that doesn't believe that I'm right now talking to a narcon that is representing that figure, that person? So the idea that any one of us isn't a narrative construct to themselves, let alone others, is the direction that I would push towards. Because I think we still, as educated as we might be, as emotionally intelligent as we might be, it's very easy to forget that our sense of self is still something that's constructed, and that it's temporal, and that it can change according to the data that we have. So repressed memories can come up and suddenly radically alter who we are and how we perceive others. And then those repressed memories can be then re-examined and turned and revealed to be fictions, and then that can radically change our attitudes. And this can change our, you know, the way we ratiocinate. This can change our affect. This can change, you know, an enormous range of talents that we might have, or injuries in negotiating the world. And so I think the first place with the narcon is to look first at who is my narcon? Who is the narcon that represents me to me? Who is the narcon that represents me to you? And who is that narcon that is kind of representing all of us? At this moment, there's Rita's room, but there's also Lindsay's room, and there's also Julia's room. And do they all talk together? Do they have an impression of each other? And do they ultimately have their own intelligence, their own agency? Which, as the narcon warned, however reliable or unreliable that narcon is not something that a narcon has. So before we get to volume 10 or 15 or 20, I think first we sort of have to look at what a narcon means and who those narcons are to each other.
Great. So let's come back to this room, actually. Since here we are.
Did you hear that, Lindsay? I mean, I'm worried that something just ate you. There she is.
The fun is taken over.
Thank you.
Tyler, do you want to pose a question? Trina?
One question I had was, like, the first time you read about them, were you, like, imagining that it was going to be included in all of your works, or was it just, like, a one-time thing and you decided later on to incorporate it?
She's smart. Yeah, there are these things that sort of live and then these things that don't live, and them has always lived and has always been a kind of purpose throughout. And I never know for sure if I will get the chance to write another book. I'm always grateful. But at the same time, I'm always aware that there are these ideas, there are these flavors, there are these stories that have a life of their own, you know. They seem far, you know, far grander or tenacious or even vicious than memes. You know, they crawl into your life and they're like, no, I'm still here, you know. And some of the concepts that you have at, you know, at one point in your life, you may radically, like, you know, sort of, you know, bury or get rid of. But then others kind of have a way of kind of clawing up through the topsoil of all your experiences and staying there. And them is certainly one, and it was always around. So it was in House of Leaves, then it was later, and then it was Holy Revolutions, and I was like, no, it still keeps kind of going there. And then it began to kind of get claws and teeth. It began to kind of move more into this book. What was interesting for me was that it kind of moved into at least the light of the text, you know, because there are many things that sort of will probably forever stay in the shadows, but them definitely had a primacy that sort of came forward and said, we need our moment. So there you go.
Think about them like it's a cat.
Could be. Maybe it's not, though. There has to be some subterfuge here as well, right? I can't be entirely reliable. You would be so disappointed.
It seems like a book is probably one of the worst objects to hold a conversation in and to sort of continue a conversation with. And so sort of on the design aspect of something like The Familiar, have you figured out sort of specific material techniques, just sort of design aesthetics that would foster that kind of co-presence that you were talking about earlier, in a way that would let us know constantly that others are there without that sort of, without them kind of, you know, always being keyed in? In other words, on what register does character co-presence, does conversation take place as material form, as narrative form, what have you? Was there something that did not work early on, too?
Yeah, lots of things didn't work. And that's a great question about, I mean, conversation is so, it's such a rich subject, and it's so important to the book, to all books. But I think it has to be, looked at a little more precisely in terms of what we mean by conversation. Because certainly in retrospect, we can say that this was an amazing conversation that we had, you know, connectivity across the country. I don't know if we have anyone in the UK, but we're doing pretty well. And yet at the same time, we've already experienced this feedback. We can't really understand what anyone's saying, you know. We can't kind of like, I can't suddenly, you know, hear someone, you know, shout out and modify something that I've said, or maybe say, yeah, I have that exact thought, but conversation goes this way or that way. I do feel that conversation, as I get older, becomes more and more important, and in some ways, what I realize is how rare it is to have good conversations. Like, one of the privileges of being in a school or being in a setting that is contained like this is that we can achieve some kind of focus. And as I, you know, and as I involve myself in kind of the routines of the day that we're all, you know, familiar with, if it's paying a bill, or if it's, you know, having something to eat, or some logistics, or correcting something, you know, on our phones, or, you know, changing, modifying our preferences, we realize like how seldom we get those intense conversations. And in some ways, I would say that literature, this is a grand statement, is the fantasy of conversation. Like we can hear these great conversations that go straight to these important points, whether it's matters of the heart, matters of of ideas, and that they actually can have room to breathe, But the question is now how to have that conversation, right? Because when I'm reading Said Faik, he's in a coffee shop and he's having one conversation with this one drunken guy. And what is this guy doing to his wife, and how terrible is that? And yet there's a meaning that can actually kind of even be teased out of all of that. Well, what about images? That's part of our conversation today. How do we place all sort of the graphic elements of our life? The way we see things, the way we hear things, the way we analyze image, the way we analyze the way language moves together. So that in part is the project of Familiar. It's first the conversation among those elements. Right? It's the conversation about, well, what happens when the words spread out? What happens when we slow down and we have a moment of sentimentality? What happens when, we have two characters that aren't even in the same space? Are they talking to themselves, or are we just making them talk to themselves? Are we understanding their context to make them part of one context, or are we dividing them? And so that, that's something that I think Rita discussed with you at some point is what I've termed signaconic. It's the sign and the icon. It's the place of language and image. It's the way of looking at these texts. And it's different from, say, a calligram, which just comes from beautiful handwriting, in essence, And it's not about, its aesthetic isn't about beauty, which of course could be part of it, but it's literally how we process what we see, in terms of an image, and what we see in terms of language, and how that creates and I like conversation more than dialogue, because I feel that there's something more cacophonous about conversation, whereas dialogue sort of at least implies kind of A, B, C, The conversation can be, my friend Pancho the squirrel out there, as well as kind of the way the light's coming in, as well as the smell here, as well as a plant, as well as, everything you're not saying or you are saying, and how we connect in this room simply by the air we breathe, and how we don't connect in that way, digitally, but in some other way. What doesn't work? All of it. Like this is 9 years later. Fonts didn't work, characters didn't work, names didn't work, settings didn't work. There's a whole set of migrations that took place where people originated from. Genealogies, brothers and siblings and other siblings were just destroyed. New ones came into being. How they talked, what was just simply a rhyming coincidence, what exactly actually has a significance that will bring or tie these things together, And ultimately, it's mortality, it's the limit of time that says this is the conversation we're having. And it's what ultimately all writers ultimately realize, is that I can't put everything in this one scene. So the scene is going to be limited to these factors and what I can get in there. And well, they do have to sit down at a table and they do have to order something, or maybe I'll be a philosopher and I won't allow them to order anything, and I'm just going to go straight to the ideas. But then the ideas get lost in their own sort of vocabulary, so I have to bring it back. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then at some point, you sort of, there's a kind of harmonizing that takes place, at least in the mind of the creator. And in this case, the sort of extended family of Atelier Z, we all kind of look at it and kind of go, yeah, let's go. Put it out there.
So in the extras.
So how's that for a non-answer?
Well, just the answer makes me want to ask about the outtakes. Do you have a favorite scene that was cut, or if you have your blooper reel?
I do have my blooper reel, but I'm not ready to show it. Yes, there in fact is a separate document where I'm like learning. No, and I think that is one of the privileges of this grand adventure, is that when I cut something, now I can always say, well, I can put it in a later volume. I can, it's not necessarily gone, and there's a kind of liberty that I have that I haven't had before in that sense, and I think that may have a bearing on its quality, good and bad, but we'll see.
So, there's a lot of work now into thinking about what it means to create a collection of papers. So I'm a literary archaeologist. I go into Atelier Z and I need to create a collection. What am I picking up? besides your hard drive? In other words, what's the material apparatus that's in place now?
You mean like chalkboards?
Yeah, chalkboards, notepads, stacks of envelopes.
Dry erase boards and computers that have various, like, digital renderings, all the splash pages, various kind of the architecture of some of the designs. Like, we spent an enormous amount of time just on the paper. You were involved with that. We spent a lot of time on the dog ears, all the colors. How did those colors? One of the problems if you come from the literary side of things is that you can't just put down two colors and say, well, they work this way because of the color wheel. You also have to say, well, blue has this very specific, resonance with me, with house. So I have to honor that vocabulary. And what does pink mean? And what does pink mean when it's combined with black? And how does pink, move to green? And if green is part of the theme of the forest, how do we honor that? And is this in collision with that? So do we have to change it? So there's a lot of material in Atelier Z. There's literally, magnets holding up like color patches and tracking like different ways that we designed. For instance, for volume 1 was the rainstorm, how that worked. For volume 2, which is titled Into the Forest, it's a lot about how the forest works and what is that forest made of and how does one enter it and what does it signify for Xanther and for the others. And that brings with it a certain set of colors. How do we view the forest from afar or close up? And so you can see that in various images right now that are hung up on the board. So you would be taking pastels, you would be taking, melted camel wax right now. We have a lot of burning stuff that was part of the second collage for volume 2. And branches, flowers that have been created, little bits of texts, animal pictures, inspiring quotes.
So should we try, Kate Marshall, I think she's somewhere. Should we try one more remote question? Hi, Kate.
Hi, Kate.
Can you hear us? All right.
All right, that's good.
We thought we'd go to Notre Dame for a question. If we can get it working, we might have to.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah.
We have turned off the sound so we can hear you. Okay, well, hi from snowy South Bend. I actually want to pass it over to a student from the serialization seminar, Connor Lloyd.
Hi there. This actually ties into a slightly earlier question that was brought up with Dan. Do you view your novels to exist in the same sort of fictional universe? Like, insofar as, is the house somewhere in the world of the familiar too, or do you really view them as like separate worlds? I mean, obviously they're not going to be totally separate. House of Leaves as a book is going to influence you, across a lot of different levels. But I really am curious, especially with how pervasive stuff like the blueness of House is in a lot of your work. Are these other books and are these other works, do they exist all together in the same world?
So starting off with the blue, for instance, I think part of that was, has always been just a personal, passion. And I use the word passion knowing that probably most of you have read that quote about suffering. I'm down with that when it comes to passion. That there was a lot of delightful and yet really sloppy kind of work with text and color in the 60s. And it was whatever you saw on billboards or in some of sort of the more sort of the just the playful kind of literary experiments was wonderful, but at the same time it so refused to have any kind of consistency to it that it kind of made a mess of the whole project, and consequently after that no one could use different fonts or no one could use different colors, and it was just this this thing that things had to become formalized. It was only going to be the New Yorker font or whatnot. And in a way, we kind of hit this kind of mini dark ages of where, despite all the text potentialities that everyone suddenly had at their fingertips with the early Macs on through, they really weren't approved by sort of those journals that were publishing fiction. That was something that was looked at askant. And even my professor in college, John Hollander, was sort of worried about this project because, quite rightfully, as soon as you move in towards colored words and fonts and whatnot, you are moving into the world of the image, of the idol, and maybe those idols should be struck down, and maybe we should stick with the vaporous, with vaporous text that kind of we can inhale, we can know, and we no longer need the vessel which contains it, which is sort of, what would you say, modernist? I mean, I guess it's slightly postmodern, but classical way of looking at text. So for me, as soon as I made these decisions, I was like, okay, this then becomes the psychology of the eye, right? So that's, and it has remained consistent throughout all my books. So I can just tell you that flat out. The second part, as you're probably aware, is that when you look at all of the books, you realize, like, oh, there really is this kind of, a kind of anchoring in the psychology of viewpoints, so that, Johnny Truant has a very specific viewpoint. He spells have with of. There are all sorts of infelicities and things that are particular to Johnny Truant, to Zampano, to Pelafina. Those are three massive psychologies that are sort of moving in on their past. And in all of them, and in that text, there is a concern with repression and what repression does, and how much we can uncover when it comes to repression, and how much we simply can't limit. The same then becomes true in Only Revolutions. We have the voices of Sam and Haley. What is their psychology? If we get lost in the history and in the strange garble of their language, you can still ask, well, if I just take it as real that two kids are on a 4-month journey around the United States, what really is going on through their head? What is their perspective? Onto the familiar, very similar. Psychology is the anchoring point for all of these characters. Now, as the author of all of this, can I respectfully repress my own connectivity to all of that and continue with any authenticity in this direction? No, I can't. Then that would be unfair. I also have to constantly work to unrepress what the characters are unrepressing. And therefore, my psychology has to be apparent. But rather than use first person, rather than actually use events or experiences or common kind of tropes for what autobiography is, you will find it probably more connected to that visual element. But it's tricky because characters in the familiar see colors with different valences than other characters see it. But they are ultimately related. So the universe that you're talking about being shared is not necessarily geographic. It's not necessarily Middle Earth. It is not necessarily the 19th century, right? But it does have, a connectivity which is probably, at least from my viewpoint, more accurate on how we share spaces.
So this actually brings us to voice, I think, in an interesting way. So the psychology of character has a marked oral component in this text. I mean, it does, as you say, in House of Leaves and especially Only Revolutions. But here the polyphonic quality is more overt. So I suppose I would want to know if you're thinking in terms of a genealogy. In other words, is it interesting to you what T.S. Eliot does with voices and dialects? Is it, other writers in the past, do you feel as if you're working within a certain tradition? And I think another question would be, would you want to situate that aspect of the novel in dialogue with contemporary discourse on lyrical realism, the project of the novel now to sort of capture the psyche of a character with a greater degree of authenticity and accuracy and precision than has ever been possible before, because of what we know about behavior, because of what we know about the brain, etc.
Well, I think one of the complex parts of whatever you want to call it, lyrical realism, neorealism, is that it's questionable whether we can ratify it, right? We can have, people can say, oh, I get it, like that's true, that makes sense to me, you know. Well, in the world of flatlanders, everyone really believed that the world was flat, and we all sort of said, well, that's true, you know. And pre-calculus, we all had a certain sense of how geometry sort of owned, you know, the registers of our world. So just because a bunch of people say, well, this strikes me as real, doesn't necessarily mean that it's real. I mean, sort of Joyce and Proust sort of introduced us to that, this sort of polyphonic sense that you mentioned in terms of Eliot is true, Faulkner is true, right? So I am definitely part of that tradition. You know, I can't get away from Virginia Woolf in that sense. I can't get away from, you know, from Shakespeare. I mean, I think, you know, I had a father who went to, you know, he survived World War II. He was in a camp. He managed to make his way to England. He didn't speak a word of English, and he got into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts by phonetically remembering to be or not to be. You know, so this was a man who sort of moved through the hallways of my, you know, childhood, you know, spouting lines from Shakespeare, entire soliloquies, you know. And he was the guy that was agile enough to point out when someone quoted Shakespeare that, well, actually, Iago said that. So when you're making that quote in defense of your position, be aware that it was one of the great stage villains that actually was responsible for saying it. And you know, as kind of amusing and as wonderful as that is, it's also kind of telling of someone who came from a world that was completely vanquished, that certain genealogies were important. You know, my father didn't talk about his family. I know nothing really about my family on my father's side, but he did talk at length about the genealogies of theater, of literature, and what. And I think that the important thing was to allow voice, you know, and I think it's hard because I feel like this is territory that everyone's covered in here, and I think that the new territory for me and the familiar is really how does one give voice to that which doesn't have a voice, whether it's a cat or a squirrel or a tree, you know, are we now going to privilege just voice, and how do we interpret voice? Do we allow voice to also have an image? You know, can it be a tree leaf? Can it be a temporary moment of foam on the seashore? Like, how do we acknowledge that conversation? How do we broaden our conversation and get away just from the fact that because we have an alphabet, because we have a vocabulary, we are then privileged to have a deciding voice in what the future is about. And yet it may be our own deafness that keeps us from that. So in some ways, it's to awaken here, and I think, you know, one of the things that would be important to me in terms of rating the success of this book for myself would be that the voices are different. You know, too often I've read books where you have different characters that are focused, you know, on, but you recognize that they're always the same voice. You can hear the author's voice ringing constantly through that, and you're like, do they really think that way, or is that this author just kind of giving words that sort of sound like, you know, them? And by building up that cacophony, whether you ultimately like it or not, it may actually allow a reader to hear the larger cacophony around. Like, oh wow, I really am hearing all these different languages, but I just breezed by them as kind of a feedback noise or something. You know, and wow, the trees really are rustling, and wow, those are very different birds, or those are very different kind of creatures, and how am I relating to that, and why am I not allowing that to be part of the dialogue that I have, you know? And then, of course, this gets onto much bigger subjects, right? It's about what we're doing to this planet, how we are involved with our environment, how we are changing it, how are we allowing sort of space for all that. So I feel like the symphony of voice, but allowing voice that is not voice, is what's important.
There's so much to ask, and I know I'm going to give everyone in the room and those watching as well a chance in a second, but can I just follow up with a question about your relationship to the past with a question about your relationship to the present? So, I mean, in broad terms, do you imagine, or how do you imagine yourself as being situated in a contemporary literary landscape? It's hard to avoid the two paths for the novel argument. I mean, I think there's a third way, there's always a third way, etc. But do feel motivated to engage with those debates, or would you want to think about yourself as doing something different or related to those two paths?
I think the one thing that frees me from answering that question is that the familiar itself takes so much work, and that there really is no room for me to write about the familiar in a way to answer that. All I can say is that it set up a bunch of rules that make it incredibly complicated for where culture is today to use. For instance, small example, I was asked to do a introduction for Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space for Penguin Classics. And I was honored. Bachelard had been an influence on House of Leaves, so it was a pleasure to write. And on the back, it was a full color cover. On the back, they wanted to put a little bio, and it was an author of House of Leaves, and I requested that House could be blue, just a little bit of blue. It's Pantone 287 uncoded. No, we won't do that. We can't do that. The people will think it's a typo. Maybe your readers will understand it, but Penguin Classics will not print your house in blue. Okay? Now, think about how much all of you in this room uses image, how much we're constantly, whether it's a Facebook feed or Instagram or however you're working, like you're constantly aware of images, and it's wonderful. It's where we are now. It's how we draw. It's our hieroglyphics. It's our text. It's formal. It's innovative, and yet even now it's difficult to get those things. So imagine you now write a book like this, which is, if you see now the advanced copy, it's like you can see the colors, you can see the attention that's gone into all the design elements. Thank you very much. First serial is sort of a rite for a lot of, a rite of passage for a lot of books. It's excerpted in a magazine. Not going to happen for the book. How do we publish it? We have to change the fonts. We have to redo this. What are you going to do with an owl made out of words? We're not going to show that. Now, it seems kind of ridiculous if you think about it. You could look at it and say, well, they put this picture. They can't put a picture of a rainstorm made out of words. Incredibly difficult. So, the book is itself, a rushing into the breach, and how I would argue for or against it. I think I'm now behind, this creature. And as I've often said to the creature, I'm just like, keep it. Just make sure if you leave it alone, that you leave it near a little bowl of milk, or you could lose a hand. So it's got teeth of its own.
All right. Go back to the room here.
And what are all these? I mean, who is like the bright pink or violet on the left? Who's this strange green head that's looking? And then there's them in the shadows.
Anyone remotely? Signal if you would like to jump in. Lindsay again.
Lindsay, the thumb is working.
The thumb.
Can we just hold on Lindsay? Or does she click it off?
It's me attempting to unmute myself.
Rita?
Yeah.
I texted you a question from one of my students here. It'll be easier.
Okay. Okay, it was a question about redaction and censorship.
Oh.
And this relates to Justin's project to your left as well. So I think it could just be an open question about redaction. And
are you comfortable that your question, Lindsay, was just distilled down to redaction? Okay.
Well, they were more specifically asking about, whether there's a code to the number of lines and words that are redacted.
Oh, so you want the answer to what's redacted. So of course I'm going to turn that back around to you and say, well, why is it that those parts, with so much that's visible in terms of hue and ligature, that it's the parts that are invisible that draw your attention? And it's actually kind of fascinating. Like, what is it about those things that are hidden that makes us, want them? And what about those things that are hiding in plain sight? And what is those? I think what I'm trying to get at, and Lindsay, I may need your help, so you may have to jump on this conversation here. Is there is the desire to decode the book, is it a desire to solve the book? And actually this would be for the room too, or is it a desire to simplify the book? Like, what is the urge behind wanting to know what is unknown in the book? Anyone have an answer? Lindsay?
Formulating an answer. We don't know why.
You can't right click and there's no...
Okay, can you?
Yeah, we...
Okay, so his response, you asked the question, and his response was that it's more about act. And your question? Okay. 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 So the student is saying that it's less about a desire to code the book and more about the kinds of affects that we encounter in a book that is so different from ways which we read novels. So the different ways look as a affects.
What's the text there? Some of the sound issues could be solved by muting. Have we already done that? We actually have muted on this end.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
But that was actually helpful. Could you, Lindsay, can you type that question so we could see the text come up? Because we really couldn't hear it.
Just, text me.
And by the way,
to mute your sound when you come on to talk. Otherwise, we end up with a big echo. I mean, the sound output.
Right. So what's the, we're doing everything, right?
Yeah,
we're muting it,
yeah,
Tyler?
we have it.
I think we're trying to mute.
Yeah. So she's just going to text a question, but it has to do.
But whoever just sent the little text message, if anyone else wants to do it that way, that's certainly easier. And I guess the question for all the little heads that are below there, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear any of this when I'm talking, or a thumbs down? Okay, we have thumbs up. Okay, so everyone seems to be hearing okay. It's the back and forth that's hard. So maybe if we can see the text, then we could do it that way.
She didn't follow up. She just said it was about affect.
So it's about affect. The book's affect?
Or if you want to mull that over, there's a question from Twitter as well.
What does he say?
He says your own mic is picking up your own output.
Well, where is our mic? Is it on this computer or over there?
No, it's over here.
No, that's just
I mean,
recording.
it's up there. Yeah, but we tested everything. But Shinji, do you remember, has tweeted a question.
Okay. Well, no, I'm still sort of puzzling over the affect questions, and I mean, it's a good question when it comes to redaction, and we have to look at what repression is. We have to look at what is redacting. So in some ways, I'm hampered from answering the question because I'm not in a place right now where I can comment on what is the force that's redacting those comments. And maybe, and I'm misleading you by using the word force. Like, what is the construct? What is the affect behind the affect that necessitates that kind of redaction? And I think it's probably one way to look at it would be Lindsay's throwing her arms up in the air. is to look at what is to look at visual space, right? So we have areas where the text is filling the page. We have areas where there's plenty of white page. We have white space that's dominated by the text itself. So when you have those like sort of specific moments, which we talked about in the very beginning, those actually in some ways deny the white space. They make that space kind of less present, less open. You know, that that the narrative itself, the way it ticks along like that, it's very story heavy at that moment. So the mechanisms draw you quickly through the page. So we no longer want to stop and pause at that white space. You know, whereas maybe in the case of the sort of this sort of lunar orbital, you know, occlusion in the wizard, that there's a space to do something with, right? That some spaces invite, some don't. So the redaction is an invitation to knowing, but it's a denying of knowing. And in that case, without tethering it necessarily to the personality responsible for that redaction, we can look at the sense that as readers, we feel, as we're moving through any text, that we are involved in a project, whether we are archaeologists or psychologists, of de-unredacting text. So it's we personally are being thwarted at that moment. And I guess, you know, the stopping point, at least there, would be like, well, with all that's in the familiar, shouldn't that experience be there as well? You know, there are elements in the familiar that are finished, that are contained. Shouldn't there also be the experience of that which is unfinished? You know, who says that a book has to come along and give us this sort of pat, you know, conclusion, this pat sort of circumscribed world? You know, that why have at what point were we given kind of a recipe for what a book is supposed to turn out to be like? And so I would leave it probably with that visible affect of denial, like that one page in the Narcon section almost allows you no room. And in fact, it taunts you in some ways, because the room that it provides is actually the room between the lines, where you could actually write what the lines are saying, but you don't know what the lines are saying, and therefore you can't write them down or translate them. And that's the experience of that image in itself.
Back to the question of the MZD fictional universe. No closure anywhere.
Right.
Anyway, so there's a question on Twitter that we can take, right? Shinji.
And then, wait, was it? Okay, then we can, so keep that text up. Oh no, it just disappeared.
I'll try.
All right, great.
So Shinji wanted to ask about translation.
Okay.
It was following from the question on redaction, and he was noticing, many have noticed, that Google Translate is useless for Jingjing, of course. There's no corpus.
Right.
The point is, it's living speech. You have to go to the vernacular dialects, or vernacular dictionaries of English, etc. So he didn't put in these terms, but one could just ask generally, if you're thinking about new practices of translation, or just what the significance or importance of translation is. You thank translators at the end and so forth.
Well, maybe the book says that you can't, you may on occasion have to go beyond the book, have to go beyond what's on the web, at least in its current state, and actually talk to someone, you know, who speaks those languages and can translate them for you beyond what the machine is doing for you. But at the same time, because of the vastness of the sort of the lingual background of everything that's going on in the familiar, I cannot even begin to posture in a way that would imply to you that I am, you know, fluent in all of the languages. So the question is, how do I find the languages? And partly it is through books. It's actually books that, you know, have vocabularies that do not exist currently on the web. It is through the web. It is a way of like cross-matching all sorts of things. And it's also about going to Singapore and talking to cab drivers and asking them about Singlish phrases. And also finally recognizing that all of the individuals themselves are allowed to have a peculiar language. You know, we typically think that when someone speaks a certain language from the barrio, or a certain language that's kind of born out of the Golden Triangle, or a certain language of, you know, Arabic that comes from Egypt, but in a certain set of decades, that they then therefore speak the language that was current for everyone, and that they aren't allowed any sort of, you know, poetic kind of missteps throughout. And that's the thing that always fascinates me, is that the stranger the language we have, the more individual it makes us. But at the same time, the more individual we are, the more we can begin to cut ourselves off from the group that we hope to sort of sustain a conversation. So it is actually gets back to this great question about conversation, about at what point does a certain particularity begin to cut you off from the very, you know, cumulative conversation that you're attempting to have.
Great. Did we get to?
I did not. There's a question came in on there.
Can you put up the text question that you it put up before? Whoever you are, you have a whiteboard in the background. There it is. Hold on. I can't see that. No. Again, put it up.
It's on the right. It's on the right.
Oh, here it is. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So this is actually kind of easy. Okay. Let's see.
He's reading questions now for those who are.
Do you tend to write sections of narrative in other languages, originally in English, and then have them translate or translate them later? Or do you choose phrases, words, languages, et cetera, et cetera? Which process do you think is more important? Well, I think if I'm just writing in English and translating it, that's unfair. So partly it's I hear certain phrases, and then by studying those phrases, oh, you probably can't even see me. There we go. All right, hi. So by studying those phrases, then they create sort of an organic tree in how they shape a certain conversation. And I have hundreds and hundreds of note cards of different phrases. I'm always experimenting with different kind of electronic applications to kind of handle them. I still use a notepad. It really works the best. And then those phrases kind of live in my mind. Then I get in a certain situation and I realize, oh, this is the kind of dialogue that would be important for that. And then I can follow up with sort of native speakers and whatnot in regards to that. So if I'm at the same time where I may have one phrase translated, I may learn that there's another phrase that's used to say that, and then that opens the conversation, can change the action of the scene, and it kind of can constantly re-manipulate the architecture or readjust the architecture, very much like my first book, I guess. And do you tend to write sections of narrative in original? Oh, I guess we've already seen that. All right, it's nice meeting you close up. All right, what else?
It was back to a question about the signa-tonic, actually. The signa-tonic. So you refer to the way the brain processes information and so forth. Do you actually do research in brain studies and cognitive studies or cognitive science? In other words, how much of the signa-tonic is informed by neuroscience or neuroaesthetics, or how much is informed by art history? I mean, I imagine it's a fusion of many different.
Yeah, I mean, the term signa-tonic came late, and I simply came up with it because I was always asked by journalists to describe what I do. And they would say, so are you a deconstructionist? Are you a postmodernist? And they would use all of these terms that were already present and kind of in the vernacular of various, publications. And so I began to kind of come up with something that wasn't freighted necessarily with the aesthetics of like calligrams and Mallarmé, but at the same time responded to the kind of work that's being done on a biological level. I mean, we talked about Catherine Malibu, and actually there's a friend who graduated from USC who was a computer programmer as well as I guess you would say a neurobiologist, and he was working on creating algorithms that would more closely mimic what the process of information transfer with synapses and whatnot. So it was, very informed about how we use our brain and getting away again from sort of these mythic ideas that we use just 10% of our mind and all of that, and how we sort of reorganize the way we think, and kind of understanding what is this instrument that we have so that we can better perceive around us. If we're looking through a very limited periscope, or better a sort of a smoked glass to look at eclipses, and then we're turning it on the waves, we're going to have a very limited understanding of that. And so for me, it's like the more we can understand who we are and how our own perceptions are limited, the more we can then begin to see the colors that are really out there, and move away from these prejudices that exist not only sort of on the visual level, but on the auditory level, even the way we smell things, and and how that influences us. And certainly we can't get away from the title. The title is as much about the great notions of the Salem witch trials and all the accompanying felines that might have lurked in the shadows, as well as just our understanding of what it means to be familiar with something. I mean, and it is a topic, as I know some of you know, that spreads far and wide. There are papers in economics that talk about why people will invest in their banks, even though they know that their banks are going bankrupt, even though they know that they can go out of the city that is going bankrupt and invest in a bank that's an international company that is 50 miles away. But they will skew towards what's familiar, and they will lose all of their savings. And I mean, so this kind of study of how we embrace what we know, those patterns that we are, that we have just sort of been shaped by and can then recreate more easily in our minds is pervasive.
So just moving toward a conclusion, what can we tell you about the experience that we had reading? Now that we're all alive and able to give you instant feedback, is there anything you want to
She says that with such confidence, and yet I can barely hear a voice from the digital void. Oh, but I see little text notes coming in. That's a great question. I would like to hear what that experience is. I guess since I'm working on finishing volume 2 right now, the question is, what do you want to hear? What are you looking for? What is the story that you want to know more about? What is the resolution that is haunting you, or what is your I guess that's the easiest question to start with. Is what are you curious about what happened? Like, what is, I guess, the driving curiosity there? And then I'm going to read these questions.
We can answer that question. What's in the box?
So there is a question here about strange loops and recursion and self-reference and meta-reference. I think what's important to me, just as a living author, is who's actually had the fortuitous experience of being able to publish several novels and have an experience which is not typical, is to avoid falling into the novel. And this gets back a little to an earlier question, which is if in terms about repression, is that as I am constantly trying to move outside of myself, and part of what the familiar does is it forces me to do that. I have to go to Singapore, at some point I have to go to Cairo, I have to go to Armenia. Like, it builds in all of these elements that prescribe for me something that I have to do in order to be true to the characters, all of whom I love. And in that way, I get away from the self-referential, from this meta world. But at the same time, as author of this, as kind of as one who's sort of shepherding this project along, I also have to constantly allow my place in it as well. And I think the way to do that is to be more specific and limit how I appear. So it may simply be in its colors. It may simply be in these specific ways, instead of always, being the guy with the cheap hat in page 8 or something like that. But how do I hear my response? Are people going to speak?
Yes.
Yeah, I have. So you're talking about like conversation, have a whole world, which could be conversating all at once to each other and itself. But you have languages, which complicate things. And then the book is a way sort of to put it down, and even though it doesn't make it any less complicated, that there are many languages to cover and many places to go and many people to meet, it sort of formulates it in a way that is, as I will say from the end of the book, manageable.
Right.
Or answerable. And so
it's a nice rewrite. It's manageable. Maybe it's not answerable. But yeah, it's answerable for her, but for you, you found it manageable. Right.
I found it manageable. But so like when you talk about like, okay, so for me, I think about books as like with their purpose, and like your style of writing is sort of inspirational to me because it does speak on a different level than just words and just language. And so I'm wondering for you if you have this intention to communicate in a way that doesn't have to be about language. It can be about colors, and it can be, can we conversate with color and with images and with, you know, just a pink book.
That's the project, and we'll see if it works. You know, we'll see if there's an audience for it. We'll see if there, you know, if it can survive. It's expensive. It's hard to do. You know, images are heavy. You know, and a simple document, a simple page, you know, of text can be easily emailed, can be texted. Whereas a recent image that I was at work on is, you know, it's well over a gig, and it needed to be printed at a certain point, and we literally had to have someone run with a you know, a thumb drive just to get there, because we just couldn't Dropbox it, or we couldn't send it quick enough, you know. And so it's complicated, and I think, you know, I think that's the exciting part about it, because I do know so many people feel limited if they have to only work with text, or if they have to only work with image. And what I know lots of people want is this ability to say, there is a way for me to express what I experience through both a visual medium and a textual medium. And right now, as I'm sure Rita has told you, I hope she has, that you are in many ways enslaved by certain companies that permit you to do that, like Facebook, like Instagram. They own the structure, and they say, guess what? You can do this, but you have to play in our sandbox. So the problem with a book like this is, except for my publisher, who's very modest, really, in all that they publish, and I do hope that you look at some of their other books, by the way, like Chris Ware's Building Stories or Richard McGuire's Here. I mean, these are beautiful, like, you know, advanced texts that deal with image as well as the, you know, the profundities of language. And yet, this is its own sandbox. It's not owned, you know, by this apparatus. And for me, that's very exciting in some ways, because as much pressure is on it, I have made my peace that, you know, if people say, hey, you know what, that was just a little too much for me, then it was too much. And we'll never know what happens to Xanther, and we'll never know what changing has to do with all of this, and what Luther is doing, you know. And that's just going to be the decision. Like, I have to open myself up to that, you know, that possibility. I cannot lift this by myself. And there are many times when I thought it wasn't even going to get this far, and then suddenly there would be a little puff of interest from somewhere else, a little this, a little that, and slowly it became this thing. So yes.
So what do you think of the graphic novel?
Good question. Graphic novel, I think, is coming from the image. So it moves entirely from image, and now it's moving closer and closer to this sort of signaconic sweet spot. You know, at a certain point, if it's so image, then you are just reading pictures. You're looking at a flip book. You're looking at, you know, you're looking at art. All of it valuable. All of it incredibly beautiful, at least in some cases. But completely detached from the linguistic elements that you would see in a more, I guess, formal or classic, you know, text. And you know this already. You read it. You rarely are going to quote the lines that are spoken in a graphic novel. You know, but then there are people who are moving closer, like Richard McGuire, like Chris Ware. You know, there are suddenly lines, and you realize, like, oh wow, that's just a beautiful line on its own, or that's a wonderful experience. So it's part of a spectrum, and it's how it's, you know, and how we're approaching something that could be both. And we all know this too, right? We've all seen stuff, and we're like, we read it, and we're like, oh, this is really good. And then we look at the images, and we're like, oh, no, that's not good. Or we look at the image and go, that's really great. But then we look at the text, and so I don't even know if it's possible. That's the other thing. It's so hard. It's so many levels of attention that it's okay to be a naysayer and say it's too much. We can't do that. We can't play tennis and be, you know, dancers as well.
So I'm just cognizant of the time. If it were up to me, I would keep you forever.
That's a terrifying sentence.
Not really, actually. Yes.
Forever is such a scary word.
When we edit the transcript, we're going to edit it.
No, you cannot redact that. Do not let her redact it.
But we are going to create a transcript, so those who are interested can always check back in and see what we've done today. And I would encourage everyone to check the WordPress site. So I'm going to be cleaning it up over spring break, but if after this conversation you have new thoughts and new comments, I would encourage you to add to the conversation there. The questions have been piling up on the margins there on the right and so forth. We just haven't had time to do everything. So we will leave you with a parting shot if you want to have any final.
But I do want to say one thing. So one of the things, as you might imagine, is that the amount of touring that I do will be incredibly limited. Each volume I will tour for exactly 1 week. That's the only time I will do tours, the only time I will do readings, the only time I will do press, and so it's a limited amount of cities. But if I do happen to come by a city where you're at and you happen to have time to go to a bookstore and listen to some sort of reading, please introduce yourself. Let me know that you were one of the people that had the early galleys and say hello. It would be nice to meet you and actually hear what your voice sounds beyond the feedback.
Great. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone remotely participating. I'm sorry we didn't get to all questions. We didn't get to all questions here as well. Thanks to everyone for just participating in this experiment exercise. It's been great fun, and I'm glad that this was the culmination. And we will see everyone in this room later today. Thank you especially.